Presidential elections in the US are really a race to 270 electoral votes, and no candidate for president can win the White House without winning at least one of the Rust Belt states. And that's going to be the focus of today's video. We're going to talk about how the Rust Belt states are shaping up, and based on the title of this video, you could of course conclude that Donald Trump is leading in most of the Rust Belt states as of right now, although he's narrowly lost the lead in Michigan, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I think it's worth noting that Donald Trump has slipped in the polls in the last couple of weeks. If we take a look at the overall RCP average, the Democratic candidate for the first time since fall of 2023 is actually leading in the national average of polls. Again, this hasn't happened in almost a year. Kamala Harris leads the national aggregate very narrowly by 0.2%, but nonetheless, I think it's pretty critical because it sort of highlights the change in dynamic in the election. No more is this a race where Trump is the heavy favorite. Now this is really a toss-up, very close election. And I think really it was always going to be that from the get-go, but I think now the polls are finally starting to reflect the fact that this race is going to be very close. And I think it's going to come down to the wire in a number of key states and probably in the Rust Belt. Now, starting off with the first Rust Belt state on this list, Wisconsin currently gives Donald Trump a 0.2% margin of victory. Again, this is basically negligible because this is well within the margin of error, so really the polls could swing either way. Now, typically polls in Wisconsin have over-favored Democrats, so if you take that into account, you could argue that Donald Trump is still the favorite in Wisconsin. But I will say the latest polls in the average overall have been worse for Donald Trump. Donald Trump has gone from, leading in the state by 2 and 1 point to losing the state by 2 points and then only winning in a tie. And so I suppose the polls in Wisconsin really haven't changed all that much with Trump versus Harris. But again, Harris was never the nominee when these previous polls were conducted. Only after the mid-half of July had she become the Democratic nominee. And as a result, I think it's going to take polling a couple of weeks to sort of reflect that. Now, this is a state where back in 2020, Joe Biden was leading by 6.5 points. Hillary Clinton was up by 5.6. Now, interestingly enough, Hillary Clinton ended up losing the state of Wisconsin by 0.7. Joe Biden ended up losing the state by 0.6. So it makes sense that Hillary Clinton had a slightly smaller lead in the state that she ended up losing than Joe Biden, who ended up winning it very narrowly. So, of course, if you take that logic, a Democrat would have to lead in Wisconsin by 6 points at this point in time to be in a good position. Now, I don't necessarily think that is the case, but you could make the argument for it. Now, Wisconsin is going to be incredibly close yet again because it really comes down to Milwaukee, the Wow counties, and Dane County, as well as sort of this driftless area in the Southwest. This is sort of the swingy part of the state. These rural dairy farm counties really swung big for Donald Trump between 2012 and 2016. Then, of course, in 2020, some of these counties did shift back to Biden, but a majority of them still swung in his direction. The reason why Donald Trump lost Wisconsin in 2020 was because he lost ground in the Milwaukee area. And this was only a margin, again, of around 20,000 votes. So this was incredibly close, and I think this time around it's likely to be close again. Now, this state is the smallest prize in the Rust Belt. It's only 10 electoral votes, but if Donald Trump wins Wisconsin, he wins the election. That's really all he needs, because this is the map as it stands today. Donald Trump still has a considerable lead in places like North Carolina. He still has about a 4-point lead in Georgia. Arizona, Nevada, similar stories. So it seems that the Sun Belt is very much still in the Trump column, even after Kamala Harris was swapped as the nominee. It's really just the Rust Belt where he's been losing ground, but that's critical because the Rust Belt could be the entire election. So all Donald Trump needs is Wisconsin, and he's leading in Wisconsin in the polls, but he's also leading in Pennsylvania. So if the race were to come down to the polling as it is today, this is the result you would see. You would have Kamala Harris winning Michigan very narrowly by around 2 points, Wisconsin going to Donald Trump incredibly narrowly by less than a point, and then of course you'd have Pennsylvania going to Donald Trump by, I think it's 1.8, about 2 points or so. So that would put Donald Trump at 297, Kamala Harris at 241. So that would be smaller than his 2016 margin of victory in the Electoral College, but it would be larger, of course, than 2020. So Donald Trump would still be winning back some of the states. The only state he wouldn't win back is Michigan, but he would flip Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. So you would see 5 flips in 2024 if this were to hold true. Now, if we take a look at the state of Michigan, Kamala Harris has taken the lead in Michigan, although I'm a bit skeptical of this lead just because the only poll that we have has Kamala Harris up by 11 points. And if we look at the average of polls overall, that is very much an outlier. So you could argue that Donald Trump is still leading in the Michigan average of polls. And I think as more polls start to come in that show a closer result, you're going to see this margin sort of get whittled down a bit, because it's very unrealistic to say that Kamala Harris will win Michigan by 11 points. I mean, Barack Obama didn't even win Michigan by 11 points in 2012, and that was still a very impressive result for any Democrat. With the current alignment that we have now, most of rural Michigan being red, Tudor Dixon lost by around 10 points to Gretchen Whitmer back during the midterms, and she was a notoriously bad candidate. Donald Trump is not nearly as toxic as somebody like Tudor Dixon, and certainly wouldn't collapse in the urban and suburban counties the way that she did. Now, I still think Donald Trump is the underdog in Michigan just because it is historically one of the bluer states in the Rust Belt. It's the only state in the Rust Belt that hasn't had a Republican senator in the 2010s. Wisconsin, of course, still has Ron Johnson, and Pennsylvania, as recently as 2016, elected Pat Toomey. So Michigan has had 2 Democratic senators for decades now, which really goes to highlight that it is the bluest of the Rust Belt states. It also had the biggest margins for Democrats back in 2008, 2012, and it was the closest state in the 2016 election, Donald Trump only winning here by 0.3%. So that was about half the margin of victory that you saw for Donald Trump in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So, of course, looking at these polls overall, again, you could still argue that Kamala Harris technically isn't the favorite. This poll is certainly an outlier, having her up by 11 points. But I don't doubt that she probably has a better shot in Michigan than she does in Pennsylvania. So, but just for the sake of this video, we'll leave it as light blue for now. Moving on over to Pennsylvania, this state is the biggest prize in the Rust Belt. It's 19 electoral votes, and currently it's one of Donald Trump's best states in the Rust Belt. He leads here by nearly 2 points. And if we look at the average of polls between Trump and Kamala Harris, there is not a single poll where Kamala Harris is leading. So that could eventually turn into Donald Trump doing the best in Pennsylvania out of the Rust Belt states, which is certainly be an interesting result because normally Wisconsin is the most rightward leaning of the Rust Belt states. Again, back in 2016, it voted for Donald Trump by 0.7%. And Pennsylvania's coalition is always very interesting for Republicans because Republicans need to win a massive amount of the rural vote in central Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh, and now really sort of in the Northeast, while sort of holding their own in the Philly collar counties. Now, the reason why Donald Trump lost Pennsylvania in 2020 was because he lost massive ground in the collar counties and even some ground in northeastern Pennsylvania, Lackawanna County, home to Scranton, which had gone to Barack Obama by over 20 points. Shifted 5 points to the left from 2016, where Hillary Clinton couldn't even get 50% of the vote here. You saw big shifts in Monroe County, Luzerne County, Montour County. Chester County is a big population center. Cumberland County. This is a suburban county outside of Harrisburg. This has been trending very leftward in recent cycles. So Pennsylvania Republicans need to hope that Kamala Harris does just about as well as Biden in the Philadelphia collar counties. Maybe loses about a point or two of ground, while also simultaneously losing more ground in rural Pennsylvania. Now, I think Kamala Harris is certainly going to have a problem in the rural counties in the Rust Belt, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of these counties in northeastern Pennsylvania trending back towards Donald Trump, especially places like Pike County, Wayne County, Luzerne County. I think you could certainly see a rightward trend. There's even an argument to be made that Monroe County could see a rightward trend. Lackawanna County, I think, is really the wild card because this is, again, home to Scranton. It's a historically very blue county. Obama won this county by over 20 points in 2008 and 2012. It was really Hillary Clinton that just had a pretty disastrous performance here, only winning the county by 3.5 points. So if Donald Trump is getting within 3.5 points of Lackawanna County on election night, you can bet it's probably going to be a very good night for him because if he's doing that well there, he's probably doing better in places like Bucks County, Chester County, Lehigh County, home to Allentown, and of course Northampton, Erie County, very important swing counties. So overall, as the election stands today, according to the polls, Donald Trump is still the favorite to win. Now, he is losing ground, and that is certain, but he's only really losing ground in Michigan specifically, where you saw that poll where Harris was up by 10, which I really think you can throw out of the aggregate. So overall, Trump's margins are getting smaller in these states, which certainly means he needs to step up his campaign efforts. I think Kamala Harris certainly shouldn't be underestimated. I think there's a lot of attacks that were useful against Biden that really couldn't be used against her. But there are, of course, other policy attacks you could lob at Kamala Harris. But I think it's really the Trump campaign needing to sort of get its act together, as they're starting to realize that this election isn't going to be as easy as it was when Biden was in the race. So I think that's why you're sort of seeing Trump's campaign sort of scramble to try and respond to Kamala being the new Democratic nominee, because she's also getting a bunch of positive press, a bunch of new fundraising, and I think that's certainly going to put him at a disadvantage for a time. But I think still overall, Donald Trump is still the current favorite to win the election, but it's all going to come down to these 3 states in the Rust Belt specifically. And now that Biden's not on the ticket, there's really a lot less of a chance that Donald Trump can make inroads in bluer states like Michigan. Virginia, I think, is certainly off the table now, which I always thought was far-fetched. But when Biden was the nominee, the polls in Virginia actually showed a very close race. Same in Minnesota. I think this time around, polls have gotten a lot more back to reality, where they're probably going to be in a normal election. But anyway, that's it for today's video. Please give a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.